interactions with white women, Chamorro women forged new political, social, and cultural spaces from which both sides aided and abetted American military colonialism, but also constructed new forms of Chamorro female consciousness and subjectivity. On the Chamorro side in particular, these new forms comprised an emergent Chamorro modernity, or new ways of being native Chamorro in relation to American practices such as speaking English, donning American-style dress and fashion, wearing makeup, attending schools, hospitals, dramas, dance halls, and saluting flags without necessarily abandoning deep indigenous values and practices. In tracing the historical development of native modernities, or native notions of progress, and in some cases, native notions of propriety under naval colonial rule, my work challenges conceptual and political frameworks that have viewed indigeneity and modernity as mutually exclusive social and cultural categories. Moreover, the readings and rereadings highlight tensions and ruptures. An excerpt by Patera Joaquina Babauta Herrera Canquina, for example, says what some of that tension was about. Despite attempts by some Patera like Canquina to assure their families that working with white men did not mean that they were, quote unquote, being together with them, the close proximity was often seen as a foolish invitation to embarrassment and even harm, and for which the woman could only blame herself. Chamorro folklorist Carmen Iglesias Santos transcribed and translated the following pre-war song, Humana Mera, that captures the predicament for the nurse trainee. In her analysis, Santos described how Chamorro nurse trainees found themselves in a dilemma because the trainees' living arrangements ran directly against Chamorro prescriptions against a non-chaperoned get-together of the opposite sexes away from home. These arrangements, according to Santos, accounted for why the nurse trainees' newfound freedom was widely criticized and seen as a source of embarrassment and shame. But this reading is an understatement, intentional perhaps, out of sensitivity to the actual woman or her family from whom this song could very well have been inspired. Thinly veiled in the song is the narrative of what appears to be the rape of a foolish Chamorro woman by a cunning, aggressive corpsman. Note also the time of day, homum, dusk. This was a time when proper Chamorro women, especially young, unmarried ones, were not supposed to venture out of the house to quiet, secluded beaches like Tomon, today known as Tuman. Before the war, Tuman was a place frequented by Chamorro fishing and hunting parties, usually men and our military personnel, mostly men, for recreation. Such time and place, dusk at the beach, like the Navy hospitals, public health clinics, and dressing stations, were constructed as geographies of fear for Chamorro women, especially young, unmarried, and unaccompanied, quote-unquote, sexually potent women. Thus, this narrative places the ultimate blame on the woman herself, which is captured in the Chamorro phrase, "Isanya," it's her own fault. It was she, after all, who, as the song begins, enrolled as a nurse. Such desire and determination were fraught precisely because they were tantamount to abandoning one's obligations and responsibilities at home as a Chamorro daughter, wife, mother, and to bringing shame to one's family. At stake, of course, was the sanctity of the family, the foundation of Chamorro society. In her seminal study of Chamorro women, Laura Torres Sauter writes that before the war, young women rarely left the house. If they did, it was to attend church activities. Even still, women's participation in such sanctioned activities was on the condition that they were chaperoned. For Sauter, such a prescription was a product of Spanish Catholicism's emphasis on female chastity and submission, coupled with Chamorro women's further retreat into the home and their proper place as taught and engendered by U.S. naval policies and educational influence. Though the Navy's presence began to offer a few Chamorro women opportunities to enter public spaces as teachers and nurses, and thus break with tradition, physical and discursive mobility was still confined by a social order of domestication or domesticity. According to Sister Joanne Pullman, Chamorro women were keepers of the home and family, whose obligations were religious in multiple ways. In her ethnography, Sister Pullman observed that the Chamorro mother, quote, was ultimately responsible to God, who had entrusted her soul to be ready for heaven. And why then she was expected to see to it that her children attended Escuela Pali, catechism, said their prayers regularly, and attended Mass on Sundays. In her pre-war ethnography, Laura Thompson observed that many young unwed Chamorro women were expected to join the Daughters of Mary Society. Thompson emphasizes the society's strict code of chastity, its rules on not going out without a chaperone, and not attending movies and dances. In particular, and not attending movies and dances. The American introduction of new social practices like attending movies and dances in particular led the Spanish padres to double up their efforts to protect traditional Chamorro society from such liberal and modern practices. Thompson also wrote that except for a few prostitutes and bar girls, only the most modern girls of Agana, including some nurses, school teachers, and housegirls, defied such conventions. Indeed, as oral histories show, the Patera hybridized American health and hygiene with Chamorro notions of progress and or propriety, even resisting the Navy's instructions at times. But if Patera were divested of their Chamorro identity and culture, in other moments, they were also denied their modernity, which I'm using here not simply as a shorthand for inevitable changes, but for decidedly Chamorro ways and desires for change and progress in Chamorro terms. In the interest of time, I'll skip numerous examples that I have in favor of one last one featuring nurses before World War II. A sense of the denial of their modernity is found in a story by Laura Thompson that takes place on the eve of the Feast of Corpus Christi in Hagåtña. Thompson tells us that she was expecting an elaborate procession, a fine example of hybrid Chamorro Spanish Catholic culture. Waiting in anticipation, she notices in the nearby Susana Hospital, in the native nurses' quarters to be exact, that a group of Chamorro nurses are huddled around a Victrola owned by American nurses. For nearly an hour, the Chamorro nurses have been playing the same song over and over and over. Thompson was in Guam because the U.S. Navy had contracted her to study why its educational system did not seem to be successful for the Chamorros. Her answer pointed to discrepancies between American educational practices and colonial policies and the persistence of native cultural, what was then called personality traits. Despite 300 years of Spanish and especially Catholic colonization, she asserted that important traces of indigenous culture remained that rendered Chamorros different from U.S. stateside children, and that these distinctions warranted a more sensitive and appropriate kind of colonial policy. For Thompson, this anecdote in the hospital is a tableau, a particularly revealing scene whose central elements capture the essential truths of Chamorro culture through the ages. In her field notes, Thompson explained that the native nurse's behavior of playing the song over and over and over was in fact a manifestation of traditional Chamorro culture replaying some elements of its deep patterns. The best example of which, in this case, she said, was the traditional Chamorro musical genre, the Chamorrita. The Chamorrita, she said, employed the same tunes for all songs, and even has something to do with the constant repetition of the same tune one continually hears, wherever one goes around the island.